Hello, my name is Reginald Webb, and today I will be discussing the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the events leading up to it, and the consequences it had on the country at the time. To begin, I first have to address a similar law that laid the groundwork for the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and this was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The fact that numerous slaves were fleeing to northern states in hope of gaining their freedom became unacceptable for southern states and would not be tolerated. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 mandated the return of any escaped enslaved individuals that fled to free states from slave states, essentially making it almost impossible for a slave to gain their freedom other than the slave master releasing them. This law went as far as also making any child born to a slave was to face the same future of never being free. Though it was federal law, multiple free northern states strongly disagreed with it and frequently rebelled against it. This included some jurisdictions passing personal liberty laws which mandated a jury trial of alleged fugitive slaves before they could be taken back to a slave state. Also, some state officials refused the use of their jails and their assistance in arresting or returning escaped slaves. These actions would enrage Southern states and slave owners as they felt Northern states were blatantly defying a federal law and withholding their slaves, which they considered properly. The slavery resistance of the North and outrage of the South were the circumstances that gave motivation for a Virginia senator by the name of James Mason to draft the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. This was one of the laws passed in the Compromise of 1850 in order to ease the tensions between the states about slavery and its possible expansion into newly discovered territories. In reality, though, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 placed stricter rules and regulations on the northern free states and their handling of escaped slaves. The new law would now strictly enforce penalties against state officials who did not immediately arrest anyone who was under the suspicion of being an escaped slave. If officials did not execute this order, they were faced with a fine of $1,000, which is roughly $30,000 in present day value. Any civilian caught harboring or aiding an escaped slave faced up to 6 months in prison, along with a fine of $100. The harshest changes this law would enforce apply to how escaped slaves were treated within the criminal justice system. The first of these injustices came with the removal of habeas corpus for escaped slaves. Habeas corpus is extremely important because it gives the right for an individual to be present in the courtroom with the jury and judge. This was put in place in order to prevent false imprisonment and ensure the accused was charged lawfully. With the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 in effect, free African Americans and escaped slaves were simply brought in front of federal commissioners, usually immediately found guilty, and taken out of the state. Alleged escaped slaves were refused the ability to testify on their own behalf, along with any witnesses that could vouch for them. Another aspect of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 that must be addressed is the monetary and professional rewards that were now being offered to federal commissioners, police officers, and civilians for the capture, conviction, and return of escaped slaves. This incentive proved to attract opportunists who saw an easy way to make money. With no safeguards in place for African Americans, bounty hunters and slave hunters had free rein with the capability of going anywhere in the northern states, abducting African Americans off the streets, take them to a federal commissioner with only a claim of being an escaped slave, meanwhile having no evidence. and ultimately be paid anywhere from $20 to $500 for their efforts. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 really was a pivotal time in America, as it made the Southern states transparent acts of brutality against African Americans, a threat to the nation that had to be terminated. This would eventually happen with the beginning of the Civil War 11 years later in 1861. Former and freed slaves played an integral part in the Union's victory over the Confederacy in May of 1865, and slavery was ultimately abolished on December 6th of the same year with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. This concludes my presentation on the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Thank you.